Welcome back to Breaking Math. I'm your host, Autumn Fnaff, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Noah John Syracusa. Today, we had the opportunity to sit down with Julia Angwin, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, founder of Proof News, and formerly of the Wall Street Journal and ProPublica. Angwin made her name proving things only people suspected, including using machine learning to catch Amazon rigging its own search results, a finding the House Antitrust Committee later used to refer the company to the Department of Justice for possible perjury. Today, she joins us to talk about whether math can save journalism and what it means to build resistance to power on a foundation of proof rather than opinion. Here's Noah to kick off things.
Julia, we've known each other for a while, and I think your career is so interesting, especially to a mathematical audience, because you were a math major, your father is a math professor, so you're brought up in math, and then you become this Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. You do this amazing reporting, but through the arc of your journalistic career, you've moved more and more back towards math. You launched The Markup, which is this data-driven journalism outlet, and then you went even further from data to actual math. You launched Proof News, where you're going beyond data to actual logic and trying to rigorously establish facts. So we thought this would be so cool to try to bring to our mathy audience. And I think maybe the headline question that we want to get at is, can math save journalism? Save it from what? I don't know. We'll find out. How do you find math has shaped your career, and what role do you find it playing in not just your most recent ventures, but from the beginning?
Oh my God. Well, I'm just so, first of all, pleased to be here. I rarely get to flex any of my math love in journalism circles because most people immediately go blank and try to walk away from you when you talk about math in journalism. So,
Not just journalism.
not
Let me
just
tell you.
journalism. Yes.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, in college, going to parties and being like, I'm a math
what's a
major
party?
was like a repellent to all possible social interactions. um yes, I did go to parties, Noah, and I as a University of Chicago math major, you are correct that was rather rare. So, the thing about math is I grew up with a mathematician father. My dad is a PhD in math and taught math as a professor before he became a programmer. My parents moved to Silicon Valley in 1974 because they were like, I don't know, this seems like math and science thing is happening out there in this cool way. So ultimately, he was sort of the staff mathematician for a big part of his career at one of the digital map companies. So all the maps that we use today come from basically a handful of original companies that did the work of bringing the two-dimensional maps into the digital space. And there's a big mathematical component to translating spatially the information into a new sphere. And so my dad really was like the lead mathematician for 20 years on that. And so you can curse at him, as I do, whenever your digital map is wrong. And although he will always tell you it's the routing software and not his underlying data. But I always had this funny relationship with math. I grew up in a math and science household. My mom's a chemist. She worked in nuclear power, working on the issue of corrosion and what the corrosion of the pipes in nuclear power plants is obviously problematic because you don't want radiation to get out. So keeping those pipes from corroding is a challenging thing. And so she was a scientist working on that. My dad was doing math and maps. And I grew up literally just thinking like, this is the only thing you could do in life. It never really occurred to me you could do other things. I actually grew up in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto. So I actually thought your two life choices were hardware or software. So very specifically, I just didn't really know that you would do another thing. And in my mind, math was just the language of those activities, right? Like that you needed to be fluent in that language in order to participate in any of those activities. So I went to University of Chicago and studied math, and it was absolutely grueling. That is a very hardcore institution, and the math program is incredibly hardcore, and I wouldn't have really gotten through it, to be honest, without there was one woman, Diane Herman. She was the only woman in the math department, and she made it her business to nurture the women students because she knew that we were going to face more challenges. And so she nurtured me whenever I would be like worried, I just don't know if I can hack this. She'd be like, you can do it. And I really, to this day, donate to a fund, scholarship fund in her name. She was just so important for my math background. I only learned recently that she was never made a professor, and they only had their first female professor in that department, I think, rather recently. She was always staff, but she taught a lot of classes, and she was a great uh, teacher and mentor to me. So, anyways, I kind of came up with this idea that math was the language I needed to participate in our digital technical economy, and so I was always more attracted to the abstract algebra, the non-computational parts of math. I'm actually really bad at addition, subtraction in my head. I grew up in that time in the 80s when everyone was like, we don't want to do rote memorization. So like they never made me learn my times tables, and I still like struggle, and I'm super mad about that. I wish they had just forced it into me. So, but I have always sort of loved, what I've loved about math has been the proofs and just thinking logically. And so when I started working on my college newspaper, just to get like actually like the free pizza that they were offering, um, I really loved the idea that you were just trying to prove something. Like in my mind, it was just a proof. I was like, oh, you want to know whether this thing is happening in the world? Like it's a proof. And so it really just, journalism weirdly appealed to that part of me that loved proving things. That said, I was 100% of my journalism career, I've been surrounded by people who wanted to be writers, right? Like, and so I always had like a very different orientation than most of the journalists I was surrounded by.
I forget where you described it. Maybe it was an interview I saw, but you put it in this way that just really resonated with me, that a lot of journalism is you talk to a few people, you get their take, you get a quote, and you put together the article. But it's so anecdotal evidence based. And I think one time you said, why don't we go further? Why don't we really try to collect data that actually can be convincing? Why don't we really try to logic out the steps? And I just never thought of that journalism is trying to establish an argument, but it often does it in a very timid, superficial way, almost formulaic, of get quotes from both sides and just kind of put it out there. So I thought it's really interesting to think of an argument as an article rather as a proof or an attempt at a proof.
Yeah, I mean, I think what journalism is really, the role it plays in society is to bear witness. Our goal is to tell people what's happening, to validate that something has happened and to establish whether it happened, right? Especially these days with AI and fakes. And I mean, this has actually always been true. It's always been difficult to establish the truth. And so journalism is about establishing that truth. And so ultimately it is an exercise in proofs, right? And I've never really understood why no one has made that case more than, it resonates for me. It's possible because we have a math illiterate / math allergic society that maybe there's a reason nobody wanted to make this argument. But the reality is that as I was pursuing journalism, I just, as you said, no, I just sort of realized like we're in this weird business where we go like what I call quote hunting. Like you go out into the woods and you like bag a quote, and, you bring it back and you're like, I've obtained my quote, or like I've gotten 3 of them. So now I can make a story. And I was just like, is this really the standard of evidence that is needed to prove the thing that I'm trying to prove? And like, sometimes it is, if it's something really low bar, low stakes, like when I went to like the opening of the local Safeway that I was covering the opening of in my first journalism job, like I don't really need that many quotes from people being like, it's nice to have a new Safeway. Like sometimes it's fine, right? But when you're trying to prove something that's bigger, or especially things that are like systemic injustices, you do need more than just a few anecdotes. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons that a lot of the things that we kind of know in our hearts to be true are hard to prove, right? Everyone knows, right, that like Facebook is like playing games with the algorithm, right? There's just no question. I mean, certainly X has made it a business model to say we're going to play games with the algorithm. But knowing, and then anecdotally, you're like, oh, this post didn't rise or that one fell. But like, you need a lot of data to prove that systematically, right? And so as I was covering the tech industry, because I was like the only like tech and math literate person in the newsroom, they were like, I was quickly assigned to that. I started to realize that the evidence I needed to prove the kind of things I wanted to prove was just going to be different than going out and interviewing a few people.
So you ended up launching, or I should say relaunching, Proof News that goes into AI and AI companies and data and analytics. Tell us about that. Tell us your motivation about that, because we're in an AI and tech boom, but everyone wants to know what all of the data is telling us and all of the scientific methods that are going behind journalism. And people don't talk about that enough.
Yeah, I mean, I launched Proof News 2 years ago with like possibly the nerdiest hypothesis ever, which was that I thought that journalism should be more like proofs and should embrace that model, and that we have a really working model for that. It's called the scientific method, right? We already have a way of like, let's say I want to observe a thing in the world and decide whether it's true, right? We have already built up sort of a bunch of knowledge about how to do that, which is you develop a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, you're open to the idea that might be wrong, you are really transparent about the limitations of your findings, and you are really transparent about your process. And so I built this sort of ingredients label that goes on each story on Proof News that has hypothesis, sample size, techniques, findings, limitations, right? And these are the key things I feel like of the scientific method that give you a sense of like how robust is this proof, right? That's the question I'm really trying to answer there, is how robust is this proof? There are no perfect proofs. There are in the lovely world of math where you get to construct every element of your cathedral of the mind, and then you can prove things within that cathedral. That's why I love it. It's so beautiful. But in the real world, right, proofs always are going to have some limitations, right? They're based on our best available understanding of the world at the moment. And so I just thought that it was a really great way to communicate to the audience that like we're part of a journey towards knowledge and we're always improving our understanding of knowledge, but we're not claiming that we're all the way there. Because I think my sense is that like, there's a lot of people saying, oh, why does no one trust journalism anymore? And there's lots of reason for it, right? And like I would say probably 90% of it is like corporate ownership that's not aligned with the journalistic goals of the people doing the work. But I also think there is a piece of it about sort of a little bit of a over declaratory style. Like we have said this thing is true. And of course, there's always nuances to those things. And so I think not being honest about some of those nuances, I think has not also served journalism well. And so this was sort of my attempt to answer that question. And then, as you said, I sort of to focus on AI because I'm a longtime tech reporter. So that's sort of an area I know well. And it's one where I feel like the coverage has really not been great. I call AI coverage, I think, really falls into three buckets. People, which is like the dudes and their lives. It's a soap opera, right? So there's people, there's the products. Gemini's coming out with a new model. So-and-so's got another model, blah, blah, blah. Is the model better than the other model based on fake metrics that the companies themselves invented? Whatever. So that's another genre. And then there's policy. And this is, of course, the most sort of, this is really fantasy fiction because LOL, what policy is being made these days? But it's all about like, should we have a policy against this or against that? And it's like, actually, Congress has like just given up on doing their job entirely. So I don't know what policies we're talking about. And so I felt like this was sort of like an opportunity to do a lot more grounded reporting. So we launched 2 years ago, actually, with a sort of classic Julia big tech kind of project where I built a AI testing platform, basically, where you could check put in one prompt and see how all the leading models responded and then rate those responses and store the data. So it was basically a way to compare how does one model do compared to another. And I was really excited about the idea that we would be able to not just write stories ourselves, but actually collaborate with the people who have the audience. So we actually did these collaborations with YouTubers and TikTokers and had them like use our testing tool to test how the model performed in their area. So we like worked with this TikToker as a geologist, and her TikToks are all about rocks or minerals. She told me minerals is really more important than rocks. And and so she tested, use the tool to test and see which of the models was better on responses around minerals. And it was, really surprising, like some were much better than others. And that was sort of our initial opening bid for Proof News, was to really like get people to do proofs, but it doesn't have to always be us, right? Then we had a little funding crisis like all of nonprofit media. And then we've relaunched this year with a slightly different testing goal, which is like, I actually feel right now that it's not really the key question we need to answer as a country is not actually which model is answering which question better, but actually what in the actual hell is AI doing to our work life, right? Like it's being embedded to every aspect of work. And so interestingly, I feel like that question has to be best answered through traditional boots on the ground reporting. So I don't have any data reporters right now. I have reporters who can speak Spanish and interview all the hotel housekeepers about what it's like to work for an AI app that directs from room to room when they used to be able to choose which rooms to clean, right? So I'm in a totally different area, but that's because this proof requires that kind of reporting, right? Like, I think it's really important to adapt the data collection methods to the questions you're asking. And if the question is, how is it affecting people's work in their lives? You need to talk to those people about it.
Interesting. Can I add a twist to it?
Yes.
Have you thought about verifying what is put on social media, especially for scientists, mathematicians, and engineers? Because I've seen this as a fact checker verification crisis as well, because you'll get someone who's a expert and they're not. And how do you show that as if you had proof of those systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in sort of a verification crisis globally, right? I mean, I think it's across all fields that no one can really trust what they're seeing anymore. And there are people who present as experts who are not, and there are really plausible looking dupes and fakes out there visually, textually, etc. And so I think proof is actually going to be a more and more important concept for, I think, just the population to get literate about, like, what does it take to prove something? And I'm really encouraged by like Bellingcat and places like that do open source sort of proof identify, like verification. I think that has resonated with people. They sort of understand that like we do need some people auditing out there. And I agree with you. There's like lots of room to do that in all sorts of spaces, especially in, social media, obviously being just like an entire cesspool of that. I can't promise that Proof has the resources to get into that because nonprofit news funding is a little scarce these days. You may have heard.
One thing I'm curious, so this is getting a little nerdy. You're weaving an interesting line here between math and science, because it sounds like you're describing the scientific method where we kind of accept that we never prove anything and we never fully know, but we kind of generally head towards the direction of truth. And in math, as he said with the cathedral building metaphor, it's very different. Like we have a set of axioms that we base everything on, and everything is a truth relative to those axioms. So to me, it seems like you're doing science, but you're kind of marketing it as math. Am I mistaken, or what do you think?
I mean, that's a one way you could look at it, right? I I think that that's true to some extent, which is that I think the scientific method is very much the model that fits better into journalism, right? Because it's meant to operate in the real world. But ultimately, the scientific method and proofs in the cathedral are all trying to do the same thing, which is, what is sufficient evidence to support this claim? And so I see them as different techniques for the same goal. And then I think journalism has also got its own sort of what is sufficient evidence to support this claim. We have a lineage of that in journalism. I'm trying to infuse it with some of the math and science knowledge. I don't get to operate very often in the axiomatic world of pure mathematics, just because the real world, unfortunately, is not like that. But I do think that the discipline of thinking that way is incredibly invaluable, right? And it's particularly valuable, I think, for like, what is sufficient evidence, right? That discipline of learning to think that way, I think, is the thing I think I took most from math, especially because I really was obsessed, like many mathematicians are, with the idea of like what makes a proof elegant. At my first my first journalism post college was actually an article called "What Makes Proof Elegant" for a magazine that called Quantum. It was like it was a math magazine. I love the idea of elegance, which is like, it's kind of like, what's the minimum viable number of steps that you could do to prove this thing that is like that makes elegance, right? Like, there's, as you know, mathematicians, there's lots of different ways you could prove a thing, and some of them are incredibly clunky and like they can get you there. But what mathematicians really enjoy is when they find like just like the perfectly elegant like 5-step proof, right? And so I guess I just think of journalism the same way. Like, what is the minimum number of steps I need here? And sometimes it is, unfortunately, just like a gigantic, collect 18,000 data points and that's how it is. And sometimes it's not, right? I mean, I always say to young journalists who ask me, people come to me a lot, oh, I want to be a data journalist. How should I do it? Whatever. Do I have to always be like really good at numbers? And I'm like, I think it's just worth pointing out, like, data journalism is just like a word for a certain type of approach to journalism where you need a huge amount of data. But there are stories where the sufficient quantity of evidence is one data point, right? And I always say Edward Snowden, when he released the FISA court opinion that said all of Americans' phone calls are being ingested by the NSA, that's it. You only needed one data point, right? And so that's why I think of elegance, which is like, what is the thing you need for this to prove this thing, right? It's not always all the stuff. It could be one thing.
It makes me think a little bit more even about verification with companies for data points, right? Especially when you're working with journalists, even on the flip side. Makes me wonder, how much should journalists investigate like AI and technology and these AI systems when the companies are essentially refusing to disclose how they work? Even that comes with some of their algorithms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like healthy functioning markets and healthy functioning societies generally have some sort of audit component, right? Like,
Right.
I don't really think that like requiring companies to release how their algorithm works is sufficient to provide the accountability that we need as the public, right? So there is, obviously, we should demand as much transparency as we can get, but like, I think if you think about the EPA, right, like they do ask companies to report how much pollution they're putting out into the environment, and then they also go and measure themselves, right? And I think that's
Sure.
a healthy system. And so I think we are going to always need both, and I'm always going to be an expert in the adversarial review. I'm not a part of the internal review. That's a different thing, a different business. And I think sometimes we get a little bit confused about the idea that like, oh, well, they won't release it, so it can't be done. No, it can always be done, right? There's always the equivalent of going to the river and putting in a little, some sort of measurement device and capturing the pollution, right? That the EPA does. We can do that. I've spent my whole career developing different ways to do that for different technologies. It's expensive. It's a pain in the ass. it probably shouldn't necessarily always have to be done by journalists. Like, there could be a regulatory agency, for instance, that would do that. But given that none of those things exist, I just get out there with my little like measurement equipment and my $5 and do what I can.
Can
Of
you walk us
course.
through one of your favorite stories you've worked on? I have a personal favorite I could bring up, and I'm curious where you used some kind of, logic or data or something to really tell a story.
Oh, I want to hear what your favorite is.
Well, I was just going to bring up the Amazon one that we discussed for my book, but I
Oh,
could
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
maybe
yeah.
actually let me try to redo that question. I'll just directly ask it
Okay.
that way. So, when I was researching my book, one of the stories I want to cover was from the Markup, the outlet that you previously worked with or founded, I should say. That was really data driven, and I'd like to hear more about it and walk our audience through this because I think it really gives a good example of what we're talking about. You mentioned people wanting to become a data journalist, so let's hear what data journalism looks like. You actually used or got your team to use at least machine learning and some pretty sophisticated things. To, the reason I love it is it's kind of fighting fire with fire. So this was a story concerning Amazon and trying to understand their algorithm that ranks products when you search for things. And this is some big data-driven machine learning algorithm, and used machine learning to try to take it apart and see what it's prioritizing. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, we had just done a big investigation of the markup about Google search, where we were like, how we kept hearing from people that Google basically, the top of the search results was always sending it back to Google properties. And so like properties, even if they were like the leading source in that space, couldn't even get on the first screen. And so we did a whole investigation and did a big computational investigation about where we collected all these Google searches. And then we basically measured how far down the page were the first sort of independent non Google results. And then showed that like half the time that was, more than half the time that was actually not even on the first screen on your phone. Right. And it was,
And let me pause here to even just say it would be so easy to write an article where you interviewed 3 people who all said, yeah, it seems like my shop doesn't show up anymore. And when I search, I see that it would be so easy to get the 3 quotes with anecdotal evidence. So actually saying, no, let's collect data and approach this scientifically. It's in a way, it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, but it's really a profound departure from how a lot of journalism operates.
yeah, it really was. And it was like, and people had done those stories, by the way. Like there were plenty of 3 anecdote stories out there because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Google search. And so what I told my reporters was like, those things you're hearing from the sellers, um, those aren't the story, that's the tip. And then the story is that we go prove it. We go get the data to prove what their hunch is. Because the real trick is, what is the hypothesis you want to test, right? That has to be informed by the truth on the ground. It can't be just something you made up, right? So then after we did the Google search one, we started hearing from Amazon sellers who were like, oh, the same thing is happening on Amazon, right? But the thing about the Amazon search results is we couldn't use the same methodology because with Google, it's this one linear thing. And so you could see where something, basically was like we measured the amount of pixels on the screen, like how far down you were. But because Amazon's was a grid and it wasn't really clear, where does your eye immediately land when you look at that grid? Like, is it the top row, or is it like what constitutes being too far below? So ultimately, we did what we do a lot, which was we talked to a lot of statisticians and data scientists. Like, how would you analyze this? Like, one of the things we did a lot was report out how to approach the problem from a data perspective. And they were like, actually, the best way to handle something like this is um, a, a decision tree, basically using a modeling approach. So you look and see how likely is a certain attribute to get you to the top slot. And to do that type of analysis, we just pick one slot. So we picked the first result, which was an easy thing to pick. And then we were like, okay, let's look at all the attributes. And so is it reviews that have products that have a lot of positive reviews, or is it products that have paid for Amazon fulfillment status, or is it Amazon's own products? They have hundreds of products under different names. And we looked at all of those different things to see which one of those things is most predictive of getting you to the top spot. And sometimes those kinds of analyses, first of all, they're very probabilistic. They're hard to describe to a reader. So I was worried, like, is this really going to sing? Like, are people going to understand what we're saying? But luckily, the findings were so stark. It was like an 8-to-1 difference between being an Amazon brand, getting you to that spot, and any of the other leading factors. And so luckily, it was so stark that we were able to make a pretty complex argument, which was like that you have to be able to put your mind into this idea of like, what's the factor that's going to launch me into this one spot? Um, and I was really pleased to see that, like, not only did readers get it, but also the House Antitrust Committee that was at that time investigating big tech, uh, they got it, and they actually called in Amazon and said, "Look, this contradicts the testimony you gave to us." And they sent it, referred to DOJ for perjury because they were like, "It seems like you perjured yourself in Congress." So we got the impact you would really want to get, which is like holding them accountable for something when with a really pretty advanced technique of analysis.
So I'm curious, are the rankings now by SEO or the new one is, I believe, AEO, AI engine optimization?
Yeah, I think that well, what Amazon did actually as a um I can't say it's in response to our reporting, but it did happen after our reporting, is that first response now is just labeled as sponsored. So it's basically like, this is a sponsored link, like, that's not even they it was
Okay.
essentially an advertising spot, but they just were,
Yep.
like, pretending it wasn't, I guess. And they were using that advertising spot mostly to advertise their own products. Um, so they kind of switched it like that. I think that when it comes to Google search, there's a whole different thing, right? Like you said, AEO, right? There's an AI optimized, way that things are going there. And I wish that I wish that I was still in the position to be able to do another round of that analysis for what that looks like, because I think once again Google is inserting Gemini answers in there that are once again basically
Yes.
taking traffic away from the underlying sources, right?
One thing hearing you describe this story about Google really makes me think is there was a time when most people got their information from the radio and then TV. So if you really wanted to understand the information people are getting, you would analyze the three main networks and see if they have different ideological leanings. Those days are gone, right? So now what you're kind of hinting at is most people get their information through social media, which is entirely driven by algorithms, or through Google searches, which is algorithms, or AI chatbots, which is algorithms. So everything we see and experience and know about the world, or almost everything, really is shaped by algorithms. So the way to understand what it's doing to us is to understand these algorithms, and we don't have access to their code. Or even if we do, it's so complex, it's hard to know how it works. So I think a lot of what you're doing, one way to say it is, you're just kind of I shouldn't say just, you are experimenting and probing and exploring these algorithms that really shape what we see and know about the world. And who else is, right? We need journalism to do that, but most journalists are too afraid. So you're the brave entrepreneur who's going ahead and saying, let's create journalism that can really confront the systems that really matter today. So I think that's really powerful. But that brings us to another topic, speaking of power and confronting systems, which is your most recent book. So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these things are really linked. I think a lot of people are like, Julia, you went from covering tech to writing a book on how to fight authoritarianism. And I'm like, wait, but there's a connection. And so let me tell you what that connection is. So one of the things that it's important to recognize is that what you're describing, Noah, is the intermediation of our information landscape by algorithmic technology, right? So it used to be that you went to the newsstand and picked which news thing to read. Now news is picked for you in your feed, or even if you ask AI a question, they decide which of the many sources it will pull from. And so we're in this weird situation, right, where we have like this new layer between us and the information ecosystem and less agency than we've ever had before. And it's important to understand that is a key moment for authoritarianism. We're in a moment of rising authoritarianism around the world, right? There's a group that tracks authoritarianism, and they say that 75% of the Earth's population lives under authoritarian regimes, and that is not including ones that are tipping, right? And I think the United States is considered to be like in a authoritarian breakthrough moment, right? Where there's a lot of authoritarian wannabe actions going on right now.
Wait, but let me zoom in. So you're saying the technology is enabling this, or it's a consequence of this?
So what
Let's
I'm
untangle that.
saying is, so I hadn't quite gotten there, but
Sorry.
one of the things is that the authoritarianism, when I started really studying it, I thought it's like 90% police state gulags, right? And 10% censorship. It's the opposite. Authoritarianism is almost 90% of it. The game is to win the media, right? You win the narrative, and then you only need to do a little bit of gulagging and police stating to scare everybody straight. And so when you think about the industry that we think of as big tech that enables all these algorithms, actually they're big media. They decide what we see, right? And so control over those algorithms and is the game for authoritarianism, right? Like that is the story. And so that's why they're so cozy with this administration, right? Like this is what happens. In authoritarian regimes, the leader always works to co-opt the media first. And you see that the first move was the intermediaries, not CBS, and taking over all those things happened later. First, it was about winning Silicon Valley because they decide who sees what, right? And there's no game without them. They could just make your content disappear. You never appear again, right? And so in the face of this, right, this industry that I've covered my whole life, that I grew up in, I started programming in 5th grade in Palo Alto. Parents in the industry in the early days, I am from Silicon Valley. I understand this space, and to see it suddenly be like the white hot beating center of an authoritarian movement, when I grew up thinking it was a movement for empowerment, right, was so upsetting to me. So I was like, how do you fight this? So basically, the day after the election, I was like, I need to build some sort of understanding of how you fight this. And so I decided I would interview dissidents from around the world and other authoritarian regimes about what works. And I teamed up with my co-author, Ami Fields-Meyer, and we interviewed more than 100 dissidents around the world. And I have to tell you, I really thought we were going to come out with a fairly technical manual, not technical, but I really thought okay, if you could just figure out which VPN to use and which secret signal chat and code words that that, it was going to be more like that. And that is not what we found. What we found was actually the opposite, which is that you can't play defense to get through this, right? And all of the covert stuff and the technical maneuvers and all that is defense. The only real winning is to play offense, which is you have to connect with other people in your community and resist the authoritarian behavior. So sometimes that looks like protest, but oftentimes it does not. Oftentimes it's actually getting your university to say no to the coercion, right? So organizing your colleagues and having a bunch of Zoom meetings and sending a lot of strongly worded emails is actually part of the resistance, right? And so ultimately, it was just the most incredibly hopeful exercise because I suddenly realized we all have a part to play in our lane. Whatever your lane is a place that you can organize around resistance, because the goal of the authoritarian is to control the narrative and then make it seem impossible to resist. And so people getting together is the only way to basically tell each other the truth, right? You have to create truth is something you have to create collectively, right? Yeah, and so I'm obsessed with proof, but one of the ways we prove things to each other is by being in community with each other and being oh, I saw that too. I also saw that, right? And so there's a huge body of literature about from dissidents around the world about a huge part of what they do is witness the truth together and be no, that's actually the lies I'm being told are lies and this is the truth, and then organizing to resist whatever the request is from the government or the regime. And so it's been a really fun exercise, and not everyone sees the connection with math. There isn't really any math in there in the book, but it is interesting to me because it's one of the few places where I went in without a hypothesis. I was just like, I just want to learn from these dissidents. I I sort of thought maybe they're going to tell me some cool code word spy shit, but the reality is that we just let the lessons emerge from the people we interviewed, and it was a really wonderful way to go after the truth, like in a different way than I have before.
But at the same time, what I did notice when reading through the book, you kind of did parallel this story to have some sort of scientific knowledge. You do take your investigative
Oh
journalism
yeah, you can't
background
take
and
that out of
you
me.
pull it in there, okay? So you are talking about recording,
Yes.
showing
No,
up,
no. Yes.
and all of the privacy and the data trails, and even little things like facial recognition. You talk about that.
Yes.
And what I've noticed is that um, essentially you have this Swiss cheese approach to safety, um, and that layering imperfect defenses and setting up those systems so ordinary people can think about protecting themselves without becoming paralyzed by fear. So, can you give us an example or two how an ordinary person can, whether that's building a community, or I'll throw another example out there that's more recent in the media, Bernie Sanders empowering campuses across the country to have political movements like this to fight against totalitarian regimes, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that thank you for reminding me that like we do. One of the things about the book is it's really it's more of a philosophy than a playbook. So I wanted to give people like the philosophical approach, right? And as opposed to the like turn this button, move this knob, right? Like and so the philosophical approach to safety, because challenging an authoritarian regime is always going to be risky, is what we call the Swiss cheese approach, which is you have to understand that every layer of the cheese has holes. And so you've got to have enough layers on top of each other that all the holes get filled in by another part of the cheese. And so you might have, for instance, you might be using Signal, which is encrypted chat, but then you want to make sure that you're also have a password on Signal so that if somebody grabs your phone, they can't open your Signal app, that there's an actual password to it, which you can enable, right? It's an option on Signal.
Yep.
And then there's another layer, which is like, well, maybe you shouldn't take any pictures in the protest in your camera roll because they could look at that. So why don't you take it in this encrypted app called Trello, right? And so we add like all these layers where you make it harder and harder. It's never perfect, right?
And it's interesting here that the forces you're fighting are very much weaponizing technology, right? Surveillance technology and things. And you're explaining how to use technology like encrypted photo and communication apps. So it's again this sort of David and Goliath, but fighting fire with fire. You are using technology and this understanding of data to fight technology and this abuse of data. So there's interesting parallels. But you always seem to be on the side of David fighting against the Goliath.
I'm definitely a David type person. Yeah. I would say that like the thing is that the technology, the thing I really came away with is that the technology itself, you have to be savvy about, but in the end, the technology that is going to serve you the best is your community. So knowing your neighbors so that they tell you when there's a stalker outside, or that you have a lawyer friend who gives you advice when you get a threatening letter, right? Like those kinds of things are actually as important a technology as the technology itself. And so one of the arguments that the book makes is really about how we have put a lot of effort into building out our like technological regimes, and people have their little rules about like I only use my social media and I use the brick and whatever, but we don't have as much discipline and about building real life community, and that we need that too, because that is actually how we save each other.
Now, something that I found to be very interesting that was brought up was that you also warn against perfectionism in the book. So it's the perfect plan, the perfect coalition, even the perfect moment. Why is perfectionism so dangerous in these moments of a democratic crisis?
Yeah, it's so funny because people spend so much time, and I listen to all these podcasts of like, what should the Democrats do, and what should the opposition strategy be, and blah blah blah. And there's like so much discourse around this. But
Right.
when you really look at like what has worked against authoritarian regimes in the past, there's not one thing, right? The man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square was run over, as far as we know, right? Like that, he's gone. That didn't work, right? But the kids standing in front of the tanks in Nepal, it did work. So the thing about tactics is focusing on tactics is the wrong thing because you never know what's going to work. Like the reality is you have to throw a lot of stuff against the wall, and authoritarianism is essentially like a freight train, and you're trying to throw sand in the gears, and you never know which piece of sand is the one that's going to stop it. And so there's just as much sand as possible in as many gears. And so one of the things that I think is a problem in the United States is there's a like excitement about picking the perfect strategy, and we basically just have to do everything everywhere all at once.
One thing I find interesting is you describe this book as you went traveling around the globe to meet dissidents and learn from them and learn about what it's like to be a dissident. But it's a little bit funny sitting where I am because I think of a dissident as someone who stands up to power, and I think of you who's someone whose whole career has been defined about standing up to power. So I think you have always been a dissident, just maybe it's been more towards economics and corporations and that kind of power rather than political and governments. But as you pointed out, nowadays especially, there's so little distinction between tech power and political power. So I think Julia, you are one of the characters in your book. You are a dissident by doing journalism, by everything you've done, and by using mathematics.
Oh my
You've
God,
been
I love
standing up
that.
to
A
power.
mathematical dissident.
I think you are
Um,
mathematical dissidents.
a new category we've invented. I love that. And I think for me, honestly, this book was a little bit of stepping out. Um, I've been in traditional journalism most of my life. I was 14 years at the Wall Street Journal, 4 years at ProPublica. I founded 2 nonprofit newsrooms. And the discipline I grew up with was all about pretending to be neutral, pretending to be objective, right? Like this idea that I shouldn't have any opinions, etc. And for this book, I was like, you know what? My opinion is I'm pro-democracy and I'm anti-authoritarian, and like I'm going to declare that. And I think, Noah, you're right that my actions have been definitely one who stands up to power, but within a certain framework that was allowed in my profession. And now I'm actually like, I don't care anymore about those rules. I'm just declaring my position. And I think it's really important to declare your position. Um, and I think the one thing we've learned about the new media environment too is that audiences actually prefer to know where you're coming from. We see that's YouTube, TikTok, that Substack. People really want people to say, "I stand for this. I don't stand for that," and they're smart enough to adjust their understanding of what you've said based on that. And so, I'm really pleased to be in a new position, owning my space as a dissident in a way that I haven't really fully occupied in the past.
It's making me think what we were discussing earlier of the difference between science and math, where in math we state axioms and everything is truth relative to those. I didn't realize this till just now, but when you say you're clearly stating your position, when you're not just trying to be neutral, that kind of is an axiomatic system. You're saying, I believe in democracy. And if one believes in democracy, consequently, almost as a corollary, these are how you should behave and the powers you should fight. So in a way, it seems like you are doing axiomatically driven news rather than trying to be impartial and refusing to adopt an axiom system.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is absolutely true. And I think I hope people appreciate that position because this is not a time to hide, right? Like when we're facing the loss of our constitutional rights, like day by day, it's important that we stand up for them. And one thing that is really gives me a lot of heart is that almost all of these authoritarian pushbacks that have been successful in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet republics and in places in South America and et cetera, there a lot of times what people hold on to is their actual constitution, rule of law. That is our set of axioms. We have already agreed on a shared cathedral that we occupy, honestly, right? That's what the Constitution is. It's our little rule set, and we decided to all play in this cathedral. And then some people were like, "No, I want a different cathedral." And like, no, we all agreed on this one, right? And so we are fighting for these axioms. That's what we are fighting for. This is the shared values, and it's actually a very unifying, right? In a lot of countries, a lot of the people who get together to fight for these things do not agree on a lot, right? But they do agree that we all agreed on this piece of paper? And so
Yes.
I think that's really hopeful, right? And I think that's why math is an interesting model for this moment, because math is just a way to practice that muscle of like, what does it look like when we all agree on the shared set of rules? What can we imagine in that space? And the thing that's super cool right now, even though it's kind of just so upsetting to watch a lot of our constitutional democracy crumble around us, is that we could reclaim this document and have an even bigger imagination about the things we could build with it, right? And there are a lot of people in that space envisioning that right now. And so that also feels very exciting and the kind of exercise that I love as a mathematician, which is just building stuff in your mind.
Wonderful. Now, I'm curious. Anything that you want to add that we haven't covered?
I guess the only thing I would say, just to add to all of the various things I'm doing, is that I've also, as you may have intuited from this conversation, I'm very passionate about making sure our media remains independent and can be fearless in the face of a state that wants to censor them. And so I've set up a new center at Harvard called the Independent Media and Audience Project. And it's really all about supporting independent media. And you will not be surprised, Noah, that it has a huge data component that I'm really excited about and will be launching hopefully later this year.
Super. Julia ended our conversation with something that stuck with me since we stopped recording. She talked about the Constitution as a shared cathedral, a set of axioms that a country agrees to occupy together even when its people agree on almost nothing else. And she also made the case that defending that shared structure isn't a partisan act. It's closer to a mathematical one. Agree on the rules first and then see what you can build. And that's it for today's episode on Breaking Math. If this conversation made you think differently about what proof actually requires in journalism, in democracy, and in your own feed, go check out Julia's work at Proof News and check out her latest book. And if you like this episode, the most important thing you can do is share it with one person who needs to hear it. And we'll see you next time on Breaking Math. And as always, stay curious of the world around you.